Hello and welcome to formalvoid. This channel is dedicated to long-form philosophical essays and conceptual analysis. This is an audiobook version of an essay titled The Unlisted Actual. It's a conceptual analysis about actuality, possibility, and realization. You don't need to agree with it, and it doesn't argue for any specific metaphysical theory. The narration is AI-generated. The essay itself is written by a human. The text is meant to be followed structurally rather than quickly. Now let's begin with the essay. Preview summary. Most theories of possible worlds treat the actual world as one option among many. Reality is taken to be a selected element from a space of possibilities, distinguished only by the fact that it happens to obtain. This essay questions that assumption. Instead of asking which possibility is actual, it asks whether actuality itself can coherently be treated as a possibility at all. If realization is inserted as one more item in the list of describable configurations, the distinction between possible, impossible, and realized collapses into either circularity or regress. The analysis proceeds structurally. It separates description from realization, shows why enumeration, finite or infinite, cannot capture the condition of realization, and argues that actuality functions as a meta-level role rather than a competing candidate. Non-actual possibilities remain fully structured without being half real, and familiar selection metaphors are treated as conceptual shortcuts rather than explanations. The essay does not defend a specific metaphysical doctrine. Instead, it isolates a hidden assumption common to many modal frameworks and reframes the disagreement around realization itself. A final section leaves open whether actuality must be singular or can coherently be plural, treating this fork not as a flaw but as the natural boundary of the analysis. Positioning note. This essay is a conceptual analysis, not a metaphysical proof. It does not argue for or against any specific multiverse theory, nor does it claim that mathematical results entail metaphysical conclusions. References to diagonal arguments are used as structural analogies, not as demonstrations. The aim is to clarify the role that actuality plays in our conceptual frameworks and to expose a hidden assumption common to many modal accounts, that realization can be treated as an element within the space it is meant to evaluate. Chapter 0. Preface. Can actuality be one item among possibilities? Most discussions of possible worlds start with a quiet assumption. Actuality is just one element of a larger space. There are many ways reality could be, and one way it is. In that picture, the actual world is a selected member of an already well-defined set. This essay questions that assumption, not by denying that there are many describable alternatives, and not by claiming any particular multiverse theory is true or false, but by asking whether actuality can coherently be treated as an item inside the domain it is supposed to actualize. The core suspicion is structural. If actual is only a label attached to one possibility among many, then the label does no real work. It becomes indexical, this one, or circular. The actual one is the one that is actual. The distinction between possible, impossible, and realized risks collapsing into a bookkeeping choice rather than a meaningful constraint. The alternative explored here is that actuality functions more like a meta-level role than a member of the possibility space, a condition relative to which a space of descriptions can be evaluated as coherent, incoherent, or realized. This does not make actuality mystical or ineffable. It only asserts a level distinction. Sometimes what determines membership and status in a domain cannot itself be treated as one more member of that domain. I will stay deflationary throughout. The aim is not to establish a metaphysical doctrine, but to isolate a conceptual tension. The tendency to treat realization as if it were just another describable configuration. If the tension is real, it should be visible even without appeals to time, causality, or physical selection mechanisms. The essay proceeds by defining a minimal possibility space in structural terms, showing why inserting actuality as an element tends to generate either triviality or regress, and then proposing a framework where non-actual descriptions remain fully structured while realization is treated as a meta-level constraint. A final section frames an open fork, singular versus plural actualities, not as a weakness, but as a deliberate boundary of what the core analysis itself decides. The reader does not need to accept any conclusion in advance. The only requirement is to follow a narrow question to its limits. Is actuality something that belongs to the list of possibilities, or is it the condition relative to which any such list can be said to obtain at all? 1. Definitions and minimal constraints. To keep the discussion precise, this essay uses a deliberately minimal set of terms. None of them are intended to carry metaphysical weight beyond what is explicitly stated. Wherever possible, common intuitions are replaced with structural roles. Possibility space. A possibility space is the domain of all describable configurations under some mode of description. A configuration counts as a possibility not because it might become real, but because it can be specified as a structured description. The space may include only coherent configurations, or it may also include incoherent or rule-breaking ones. Nothing in the argument depends on where that boundary is drawn. What matters is that the space is structural. Its elements can be compared, distinguished, and organized by internal relations, not by their realization status. Structural description. A structural description is a specification of relations, constraints, or properties that does not presuppose realization. Structural descriptions can be rich, detailed, internally consistent, and even maximally complete without being actual. Describability alone does not imply existence in the sense of realization. Coherence and incoherence. A description is coherent if it satisfies the internal constraints of the descriptive framework being used. It is incoherent if it violates those constraints. This distinction is purely internal to the possibility space and does not imply anything about realization. Coherence is not a step toward actuality. It is only a condition on descriptions. Incompatibility. Two descriptions are incompatible if they cannot jointly obtain without contradiction. Incompatibility is logical or structural, not temporal. It does not require a process of exclusion. It only marks that certain descriptions cannot simultaneously be satisfied. Realization. Realization refers to the status of a description that obtains. Crucially, realization is not defined as the description that happens to be selected, or the one with the highest priority. It is introduced only as a status distinction whose role will be examined, not assumed. At this stage, realization is treated as a primitive label whose placement is in question. Meta-level. A meta-level distinction is a distinction between elements within a domain and the condition or rule relative to which elements of that domain are classified, evaluated, or related. Calling something meta does not mean it is outside logic or beyond description. It means it is not an element of the domain whose structure it helps determine. Domain relative existence. The term existence is used in a domain relative sense. A structural description can exist as an element of a possibility space without being realized. This avoids conflating existence with actuality and allows non-actual configurations to be fully structured without contradiction. Minimal constraints. The analysis that follows relies only on the following constraints. 1. Possibilities are defined structurally, not modally. 2. Structural coherence does not imply realization. 3. Incompatibility is a logical relation, not a temporal process. 4. No assumption is made about time, causality, or physical selection. 5. No assumption is made about whether realization is singular or plural. With these definitions in place, the question can be stated cleanly. If the possibility space is defined purely structurally, what role, if any, can actuality play inside it without collapsing into triviality or regress? The next section examines what happens when actuality is treated as just another member of that space. Number 2, why actual is not a member. A common way of thinking about reality treats the actual state as one element within a broader space of possibilities. On this view, there is a set of describable configurations, and one of them carries the additional label actual. At first glance, this seems harmless. The actual world is simply the world that obtained. The problem is that under minimal constraints, this move quietly undermines the distinction it is meant to capture. If actual is a property that can be attached to an element of the possibility space, then two questions immediately arise. First, what distinguishes that element from the others besides the label itself? Second, why does the label apply to that element rather than to another? If no further structure is provided, the answer collapses into circularity. The actual description is the one that is actual. One might try to avoid this by appealing to selection, priority, or preference. But these notions introduce exactly what the framework has bracketed: temporal processes, causal mechanisms, or evaluative criteria. More importantly, they treat realization as something that happens to a possibility, rather than as a condition that structures the domain in which possibilities are even evaluated. There is a deeper structural problem. The possibility space is defined as the domain of descriptions that can be compared, related, and distinguished without reference to realization. If actuality is inserted as an element of that space, then it becomes subject to the same relations as any other description. It must be comparable, compatible, or incompatible, closer or farther, better or worse. In that case, actual no longer marks a categorical difference. It becomes just another predicate within the system. At that point, the label does no explanatory work. Calling one description actual adds no structure beyond what is already contained in the space of descriptions. The distinction between realized and non-realized collapses into a bookkeeping convention. One item is flagged, but nothing in the framework explains or constrains that flagging. The collapse becomes clearer when incompatibility is considered. If incompatible descriptions cannot jointly obtain, then treating actuality as an element implies that incompatible actualities are at least conceptually on the same footing. The framework must then either allow multiple actual elements or introduce an external rule to forbid them. In both cases, actuality is no longer self-contained as a concept. It requires a higher-level constraint to do its intended work. This reveals the core issue. Actuality cannot be both a member of the possibility space and the principle that distinguishes realized from non-realized descriptions. If it is treated as a member, it loses its asymmetry. If it is treated as the distinguishing principle, it cannot be one more item among those it distinguishes. The conclusion is not that actuality is mysterious or ineffable, but that it plays a different structural role. Whatever actual means, it does not function coherently as an element of the possibility space. Treating it as such either empties the concept of content or forces the introduction of an unacknowledged meta-level to repair the damage. The next step is to show that rejecting actuality as a member does not force non-actual descriptions into non-existence, nor does it deny them structure. That distinction is the focus of the next section. Numberstarb 3. Structural existence versus realization. Rejecting actuality as a member of the possibility space can appear to force a stark alternative. Either a description is realized, or it is nothing. This impression is misleading. It arises from conflating structure with realization, a conflation the present framework is designed to avoid. A structural description can be fully specified, internally coherent, and richly constrained without being realized. Its status as a description does not depend on whether it obtains. Structural existence, in this sense, is simply membership in a domain of describable configurations. It carries no implication of causal efficacy, temporal presence, or metaphysical weight beyond that role. This distinction explains why non-actual descriptions can meaningfully differ from one another. Two non-realized configurations can be closer or farther from a realized configuration in terms of shared structure, constraints, or relations. They can differ in coherence, complexity, or internal organization. None of this requires them to be partially realized, or halfway actual. The comparisons are entirely internal to the possibility space. Terms like close, feasible, or admissible often invite misinterpretation. They are easily mistaken for gradients of actuality, as if some descriptions were almost real while others were barely possible. In this framework, such terms are strictly epistemic or structural. They describe relations between descriptions, similarity, constraint satisfaction, or rule adherence, not degrees of realization. The intuition that some non-actual descriptions are nearly actual is best understood as an artifact of our descriptive perspective. From within a realized configuration, certain alternatives share many of its constraints and properties, making them easy to imagine or reconstruct. Others diverge sharply and appear remote. This asymmetry reflects the structure of the description space, not a partial realization leaking into non-actual states. It is therefore a mistake to treat realization as the final step of a continuous process that begins with coherence and increases through feasibility toward actuality. Coherence does not accumulate into realization, and admissibility does not approximate it. Realization, whatever its nature, marks a categorical boundary, not a limit point of structural refinement. This boundary does not diminish the status of non-actual descriptions. On the contrary, it allows them to retain full structural integrity without being reduced to failed attempts at actuality. They are not unreal in the sense of being undefined or empty. They are unrealized in the precise sense that realization is not one of their properties. With this distinction in place, the next question becomes sharper. If non-actual descriptions can be fully structured and enumerated, how can realization itself be specified without re-entering the possibility space it distinguishes? Addressing that question requires examining enumeration and its limits. 4. Enumeration without capture. Once non-actual descriptions are allowed to be fully structured, it is natural to assume that they can also be exhaustively listed. Given enough expressive power, one might expect to enumerate all possible configurations, finite or infinite, simple or complex, coherent or incoherent. If actuality were one such configuration, then in principle it should appear somewhere on that list. This expectation rests on a hidden assumption that listing a domain is sufficient to capture everything that matters about it. The present framework rejects that assumption. An enumeration, even an infinite one, is a relation between a domain and a scheme of representation. It orders, indexes, or associates descriptions with positions in a list. What it does not do is supply the condition under which any description on the list obtains. Enumeration presupposes a domain of descriptions. It does not explain how realization enters that domain. This gap is not a practical limitation. It persists even under idealization. Suppose the enumeration is complete, infinite, and maximally detailed. Suppose every coherent description appears somewhere, and suppose even incoherent descriptions are included for completeness. The list may be arbitrarily rich, but it remains a list of descriptions. Nothing about listing, by itself, marks one description as realized. One might respond by adding a marker, a special tag that designates which entry is actual. But this move simply relocates the problem. The marker is not itself part of the description it marks. It is an additional structure imposed on the list. If the marker is treated as another entry, the same question reappears at a higher level. If it is not, then realization has already been displaced to a meta level relative to the enumeration. This reveals a general point. No enumeration, regardless of its size or completeness, can contain the condition that determines realization as an element among the enumerated items. That condition operates on the enumeration. It is not one of its members. The distinction is structural, not numerical. Increasing the size of the list does not move the realization condition closer to being captured by it. The idea of unlisted but definable constructions helps clarify this point. A rule or specification can be given relative to an enumeration that guarantees it does not coincide with any listed element, not because it is vague or ineffable, but because it is defined in terms of the list as a whole. Its role is relational rather than enumerative. The relevance of this observation is not mathematical, but structural. Realization, like such constructions, is intelligible by its role relative to the space of descriptions. It can be specified as the condition under which descriptions obtain without being reducible to one description among others. Treating realization as an item to be found in a list misunderstands the kind of role it plays. The consequence is not that realization is inaccessible or beyond description, but that it belongs to a different level of analysis. Enumeration organizes descriptions. Realization evaluates them. Confusing these functions leads either to triviality, where actual becomes a redundant label, or to regress, wherever more elaborate lists are introduced to recover what was lost. This prepares the ground for the next step, using diagonal-style reasoning as a motivating analogy for why realization is definable relative to a domain without being contained within it. Number 5. Diagonal intuition, motivation, not proof. The claim that realization operates at a different level than the descriptions it evaluates can feel abstract or ad hoc. To make the level distinction more concrete, it is useful to appeal to a familiar structural pattern, diagonal-style reasoning. This appeal is motivational, not demonstrative. Nothing in what follows is intended as a proof about actuality. It is an illustration of how certain roles cannot be filled by elements of the domains they organize. In diagonal arguments, one begins with an assumedly complete enumeration of elements, strings, functions, numbers, or descriptions. The crucial move is not the construction of something mysterious, but the definition of an object relative to the enumeration itself. The resulting construction is perfectly well defined, yet it cannot coincide with any element of the list because its defining relation ensures divergence from every listed item. What matters here is not cardinality or infinity as such. The force of diagonal reasoning does not come from having too many elements, but from a shift in level. The diagonal construction is not an especially large or complex member of the domain. It is defined by how it relates to the enumeration as a whole. Its exclusion from the list is structural, not accidental. This pattern provides a useful analogy for thinking about realization. The space of possibilities can be as rich, infinite, and detailed as one likes. It can contain every describable configuration under a given framework. But realization is not a description that waits to be located somewhere within that space. Like a diagonal construction, it is specified by its relation to the domain. It fixes which descriptions obtain rather than adding another description to be evaluated. The analogy must be handled carefully. Diagonal arguments do not show that something exists outside all domains, nor do they establish metaphysical priority. They show only that certain roles, those defined in terms of a domain as a whole, cannot be discharged by elements of that domain. To mistake this for a claim about ineffability or transcendence is to misread the lesson. Applied to the present framework, the diagonal intuition supports a modest conclusion. If realization is defined by how it evaluates or fixes the status of descriptions, then treating it as one more description among others is a category error. No amount of expansion or refinement of the possibility space changes this, because the issue is not incompleteness, but misclassification. Seen this way, diagonal reasoning does not justify any specific metaphysical thesis about actuality. It clarifies why certain attempts to locate actuality within the possibility space predictably fail. Realization, like a diagonal construction, is intelligible by its role, but misplaced when treated as an element. With this motivation in place, the framework can now be stated more directly. Actuality should be understood as a meta-level role that evaluates descriptions, not as a candidate description competing for realization. The next section develops this idea explicitly and shows how it avoids temporal, causal, and selection-based misunderstandings. Number 6. Actuality as a meta-level role. If actuality is neither a member of the possibility space nor the outcome of a selection process within it, then its role must be specified differently. The proposal developed so far is that actuality functions as a meta-level condition, a role relative to which descriptions are evaluated as realized or non-realized. Under this interpretation, actuality is not a competing candidate among possibilities. It is not something descriptions approach, approximate, or fail to reach. Nor is it a property that can be added to a description without altering the structure of the framework. Instead, actuality is the condition that fixes which descriptions obtain at all. This shift in role immediately dissolves a number of persistent confusions. If actuality is a meta-level condition, then it does not arise through temporal becoming, causal competition, or priority ordering. There is no need to imagine a process in which possibilities wait in line, compete for realization, or transition from non-actual to actual. Such metaphors presuppose that realization is something that happens to descriptions, rather than a condition that structures the domain in which descriptions are assessed. Treating actuality as evaluative rather than competitive also explains why attempts to locate it within the possibility space repeatedly generate regress. If actuality were an element, then some further condition would be needed to explain why that element, rather than another, is actual. By contrast, if actuality is the condition under which elements are evaluated, no such further explanation is required. The role is not filled by an object that could have failed to fill it. It is defined by what it does. This does not make actuality arbitrary or inexplicable. Evaluation roles are familiar across domains. A truth assignment is not one of the propositions it evaluates. A modal is not one of the sentences it satisfies. An interpretation function is not an interpreted value. In each case, the role is intelligible, describable, and constrained. even though it is not an element of the domain it organizes. The same applies here. Actuality can be characterized by its function. It determines which structural descriptions obtain. That characterization is sufficient to explain its asymmetry without reintroducing hidden temporal or causal assumptions. The framework does not deny that physical processes occur within an actual configuration. It denies that the concept of actuality itself must be grounded in such processes. By relocating actuality to the meta level, the framework preserves the full structural richness of the possibility space while avoiding the collapse of realization into a redundant label. Non-actual descriptions remain fully describable and comparable, but they are no longer misconstrued as failed or incomplete actualities. Realization marks a categorical difference in role, not a quantitative difference in degree. With this role clarified, one final issue remains unresolved. Whether the meta-level role of actuality must be unique, or whether multiple such roles can coexist without collapsing back into an object-level plurality. That open question and its implications are addressed in the next section. Number 7. Non-actuality is not nothing. Once actuality is treated as a meta-level role, a familiar worry reappears in a different form. If realization is categorical and if only realized descriptions obtain, then what status remains for non-actual descriptions? The concern is that everything outside realization collapses into an undifferentiated nothing. This concern rests on a false dichotomy. Non-actuality is not equivalent to non-structure. A description can fail to be realized while remaining fully specified, internally constrained, and richly organized. Non-actual descriptions belong to the possibility space by virtue of their structure, not by virtue of their realization status. Their non-actuality does not erase their internal relations or reduce them to empty placeholders. It simply marks that realization is not among their properties. This distinction becomes clearer when considering the difference between unrealized coherent descriptions and incoherent ones. A coherent but unrealized description satisfies the internal constraints of the descriptive framework. An incoherent description violates them. These two kinds of descriptions differ significantly in structure, even though neither is realized. Their shared non-actuality does not eliminate that difference. It only abstracts away from it at the level of realization. In other words, non-actuality is a shared status, not a shared structure. It groups descriptions by what they lack, realization, without flattening the distinctions that exist among them. Treating non-actuality as nothing mistakenly projects the absence of realization onto the absence of form. This mistake is often encouraged by intuitive metaphors. We tend to imagine the actual as filled and the non-actual as empty, as if structure itself depended on being realized. But structure is supplied by description, not by realization. A description does not become internally articulated by being actualized. It becomes actualized by satisfying whatever condition defines realization. Recognizing this point prevents a common slide into mysticism. One need not claim that non-actual descriptions inhabit some shadow realm or quasi-existence. Nor must one deny them all status. Their status is precisely what the framework assigns. They exist structurally, but not as realized configurations. This also clarifies why impossibilities and unrealized coherences can be treated together at a certain level of analysis. From the perspective of realization, both are non-actual. From the perspective of structure, they differ sharply. Keeping these perspectives distinct avoids both extremes, reducing non-actuality to nothingness and inflating it into an alternative form of actuality. With this in place, the framework has separated three notions that are often conflated: structure, coherence, and realization. The remaining task is to examine whether the meta-level role of actuality must be unique or whether it can coherently be plural. That question marks a deliberate boundary of the core analysis and is taken up in the next section. Number 8. The open fork, singular versus plural actualities. Up to this point, the framework has treated actuality as a meta-level role rather than an element of the possibility space. What it has not settled is whether that role must be unique or whether it can be instantiated in more than one way. This indeterminacy is not an oversight. It is a structural consequence of the analysis itself. Nothing in the preceding arguments requires that there be exactly one actuality. The rejection of actuality as a member of the possibility space rules out only one claim, that realization is simply a predicate attached to a description within a single domain. It does not, by itself, determine how many realization conditions there may be, nor whether they are mutually exclusive. This creates a genuine fork. On a singular actuality interpretation, there is exactly one meta-level condition of realization. All descriptions are evaluated relative to it, and incompatibility guarantees that only one configuration can obtain. This view emphasizes determinacy and treats actuality as globally exclusive. It is conceptually clean, but it introduces an additional commitment that the realization role cannot be instantiated more than once. On a plural actualities interpretation, there may be multiple meta-level realization conditions, each relative to its own structured domain of descriptions. Importantly, this is not a return to object-level plurality. The claim is not that many descriptions within one possibility space are simultaneously actual. Rather, it is that there may be multiple non-combinable evaluation frameworks, each with its own actuality. Under this interpretation, plural actualities do not coexist within a shared higher-level space. There is no global list in which all actualities appear as elements. Each actuality is meta-relative to its own domain, and there is no further actuality that unifies them. The plurality is therefore meta-level, not enumerative. This distinction is crucial. Without it, plural actualities would collapse back into familiar many worlds pictures, where multiple realized configurations are treated as elements of a single overarching domain. The present framework explicitly blocks that collapse by denying that realization is an object-level property at all. The core framework is compatible with both interpretations because its central claim concerns role, not count. It establishes that actuality is structurally distinct from possibility, but it does not legislate how many times that role may be instantiated. Deciding between singular and plural actualities requires an additional principle, one not supplied by the analysis of realization alone. Rather than forcing a resolution, the framework treats this fork as informative. It shows precisely where further assumptions must enter if exclusivity is to be defended or rejected. In that sense, the unresolved choice is not a weakness, but a diagnostic result. The analysis has been carried as far as it can go without importing new commitments. The next section uses this result to evaluate the framework itself by testing it against common failure modes such as regress, hidden selection mechanisms, and unintended collapses back into object-level metaphysics. 9. A diagnostic test suite. The framework developed so far is intentionally minimal. Its strength depends not on the number of claims it makes, but on whether it avoids predictable failure modes. This section summarizes a set of diagnostic tests that any account of actuality should pass if it is to remain coherent under the constraints introduced earlier. These tests are not proofs. They are consistency checks designed to expose hidden assumptions and structural collapse. Regress test. If actuality is treated as an element or outcome, the framework must explain why that element is actual rather than another. If the explanation appeals to a further actuality condition, the account enters regress. The present framework avoids this by treating actuality as a role, not a selectable object. Any proposal that reintroduces selection at the same level fails this test. Hidden selection test. Many accounts implicitly rely on selection metaphors, competition, prioritization, optimization, or transition from non-actual to actual. These metaphors smuggle in temporal or causal machinery that the framework explicitly brackets. A coherent account must specify whether such mechanisms are genuinely required or whether they merely disguise a structural distinction. If selection language does explanatory work without being acknowledged, the framework collapses back into process-based metaphysics. Circularity test. A definition of actuality must not presuppose realization in order to explain realization. Defining the actual as the realized possibility or the one that happens merely restates the problem. The framework passes this test only if possibility is defined structurally and independently of realization, and actuality is characterized by role rather than by membership. Level collapse test. The framework relies on a clear separation between object-level descriptions, possibilities, and meta-level conditions, realization. If these levels are blurred, If actuality is allowed to function both as an element and as an evaluator, the distinction collapses. Any account that allows actuality to re-enter the possibility space as a description fails this test. Accidental many worlds test. Plural actualities are only coherent if they remain meta-relative. If multiple realized descriptions are treated as coexisting elements of a single domain, the framework collapses into an object-level many worlds picture. This test ensures that plurality, if allowed, is not merely rebranded enumeration. Triviality test. Finally, the framework must do more than restate that what is actual is actual. If removing the concept of actuality from the account leaves nothing unexplained or unchanged, then actuality was doing no real work. A successful framework shows that treating actuality as a meta-level role changes how possibility, incompatibility, and realization are understood. Together, these diagnostics function as a constraint system. They do not guarantee truth, but they delimit what a coherent account of actuality can look like, once the assumption that realization is just another property is abandoned. The final section compresses the framework into its minimal commitments and restates the open questions that remain. Sharp 10. Costs and consequences. Recasting actuality as a meta-level role rather than an element of the possibility space is not a neutral move. It has clear costs as well as clear benefits. Making these explicit is part of the framework's discipline. What is lost? Lost is into comfort. Treating the actual world as one option among many fits naturally with everyday reasoning and with common metaphors of choice, chance, or selection. Abandoning this picture removes the sense that actuality is something we can point to directly as a member of a familiar category. The framework resists that intuition rather than accommodating it. A second loss is naive ontology. Many accounts implicitly assume that reality consists of things, and that actuality is just one more thing added to an otherwise complete inventory. Treating actuality as a meta-level role blocks this move. It denies that realization is a substance, property, or additional object that can be placed alongside others. For readers expecting a concrete ontological addition, this can feel unsatisfying or evasive. A third loss concerns one more thing explanations. If actuality is not an element, then it cannot serve as a causal plug or a final explanatory token. One cannot say this description is real because actuality attaches to it, as if actuality were a detachable cause. The framework refuses to explain realization by introducing a further realized item. For those seeking a final explanatory object, this will appear deflationary. What is gained? What is gained in return is clarity of disagreement. By separating structure from realization and relocating actuality to a meta-level role, the framework makes explicit where competing views diverge. Disputes about many worlds, modal realism, or exclusivity are no longer blurred by shared but unexamined assumptions about what actuality is supposed to be. The framework also gains conceptual economy. Instead of multiplying ontological commitments, it restricts the role of actuality to what is strictly required, fixing which descriptions obtain. Everything else, structure, coherence, incompatibility, remains within the descriptive domain. This reduces the risk of hidden circularity and unexplained duplication. Another gain is diagnostic power. Once actuality is treated as a role, many familiar confusions become visible as category errors, selection metaphors that do no work, appeals to priority that presuppose what they explain, or attempts to rank possibilities by closeness to reality. The framework does not solve these issues, but it reveals where they enter. Finally, the framework gains flexibility without relativism. By not deciding the singular versus plural question at the core level, it allows extensions in either direction without rewriting its foundations. Disagreement is pushed to a clearly marked boundary, rather than being smuggled into basic definitions. Net result. The cost of the framework is the loss of a simple picture in which actuality behaves like a familiar object. The benefit is a sharper account of what actuality does, what it does not do, and where further commitments must be added if one wants more than structural clarity. The trade-off is intentional. The aim is not to preserve intuitive metaphysics, but to expose the structure of the problem as cleanly as possible. With that structure in view, even unresolved questions become informative rather than obscuring. The final section compresses the framework into its minimal commitments and restates the central insight without elaboration. 11. Structural summary, final compression. The framework developed in this essay can be reduced to a small number of commitments. Everything else, examples, diagnostics, and analogies, serves only to motivate or test these points. First, possibilities are defined structurally. A possibility is a describable configuration, specified by relations and constraints, independent of whether it is realized. Coherence, incoherence, similarity, and incompatibility are internal relations within this space and do not presuppose realization. Second, structural existence is distinct from realization. A description can be fully structured without being realized. Realization is not a degree of structure, not a limit point of coherence, and not something approximated by feasibility or closeness. It marks a categorical difference in role, not a quantitative difference in content. Third, actuality cannot coherently be treated as a member of the possibility space. If it is inserted as an element, it either becomes a redundant label or generates regress by requiring a further condition to explain its privileged status. Treating actuality as an object among objects collapses the distinction it is meant to express. Fourth, actuality is best understood as a meta-level role, the condition relative to which descriptions are evaluated as realized or non-realized. This role is intelligible by function rather than by enumeration. It does not require temporal becoming, causal selection, or priority ordering, and it does not compete with descriptions inside the space it evaluates. Fifth, non-actuality is not equivalent to nothingness. Non-actual descriptions retain full structural differentiation. Unrealized coherent descriptions and incoherent ones differ internally, even though both lack realization. Non-actuality is a shared status, not a shared structure. From these commitments follows a deliberately limited result. The framework does not decide whether actuality is singular or plural. It shows only that if actuality is plural, that plurality must be meta-level and non-combinable, and that if actuality is singular, its exclusivity must be defended by an additional principle not supplied here. The remaining open question can therefore be stated cleanly. Is the meta-level role of actuality uniquely instantiated, or can it be instantiated in multiple irreducible ways without collapsing back into object-level plurality? The framework does not answer this question. It identifies where the answer must come from and what constraints any answer must satisfy. That boundary is not a failure of analysis, but its endpoint. Once actuality is no longer treated as one more thing, disagreement about its scope becomes visible rather than obscured. If the framework succeeds, it does so not by resolving the metaphysics of actuality, but by clarifying the structure of the problem itself. If you like this video and find this content useful, please like the video or subscribe for future essays.